This is Apropos. Experts say they represent a new era in warfare, posing a threat to scientific progress and research. Talks have been held at the UN this week on efforts to revive attempts to regulate AI-controlled autonomous weapons, as campaigners warn the time is running out to put guardrails on the fastly evolving technology. Selena Sykes has more.
La première bombe atomique de l'histoire.
Nearly 80 years after the US dropped the atomic bomb, now artificial intelligence is rewriting laws of war again.
Machines don't see us as people.
Advances in technology are making it possible to develop autonomous weapons systems that can pick and attack their targets without human guidance, based on sensor processing which matches what is detected on the ground against a target profile. Autonomous weapons and AI-assisted weapons are already being used on the battlefield. Around 200 autonomous weapon systems have been deployed across Ukraine, the Middle East and Africa, according to weapons experts at the Future of Life Institute think tank. The Ukrainian military has used AI-equipped drones with explosives to fly into battlefields and strike Russian oil refineries, while American AI systems have identified targets in Syria and Yemen for airstrikes. Such technology has generally been used against clear-cut military targets, and most importantly, remains under tight supervision, with a human in the loop to make decisions instead of ceding total control to a machine. But there is increasing concern over weapons being given full autonomy over their use of force and the possibility of lethally targeting humans. A potential slide to digital dehumanization that has led NGOs and more than 100 countries to call for an international treaty on the use of AI in warfare. As the technology continues to rapidly develop, experts are warning that time is running out to establish guardrails on its use.
Well, for more, we're joined now from New York by Dr Matt Mahmoudi, an assistant professor in digital humanities at the University of Cambridge. Matt, thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. Rewriting the laws of war was how it was put in that report there. What are your specific concerns when it comes to these AI-controlled weapons?
We think that autonomous weapon systems, in particular autonomous weapon systems that are anti-personnel and target individuals, are fundamentally incompatible with international law. We've seen time and time again how AI technologies that are used in the context of both peacetime and warfare that rely on mass surveillance data that are targeting discriminately against particular groups, often based on predicted characteristics, end up leading to incalculable amounts of human rights violations. We've seen reports of target acquisition systems used in Gaza. We've seen AI-driven surveillance used in Hebron and in East Jerusalem, facial recognition algorithms used and deployed by the NYPD in New York City, automated decision-making systems used across Europe to attempt to try to establish fraud in benefit recipients. These are all systems that figure into autonomous weapon systems. And so if we know that the individual component systems are incompatible with international human rights law and international humanitarian law, there's no way systems that are made up of these products can be done in a way that's compliant with international law. So they have to be banned and they have to be a part of a legally binding instrument that states have to agree on at the UN.
And suggestions as well that some of those component technologies are already being deployed with problematic consequences. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So we know that the technologies that make up autonomous weapon systems come in the forms that have been deployed already in the last 10 to 15 years. We know that from predictive analytics, predictive policing technologies, for example, that oftentimes communities, especially racialized and socioeconomically poorer communities, are subject to negative feedback loops, which means that historical data about them and levels of crime and socioeconomic depravity are often used to make calculations probabilistically of the likelihood of these communities engaging in committing crimes. And oftentimes you are trapped by the socioeconomic and racialized conditions that you find yourselves in. And so it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We've seen with facial recognition algorithms time and time again that it's Black and brown communities and poorer communities that are targeted by these systems. I mean, in the NYPD, Black Lives Matter protesters were targeted en masse. We know that activists were harassed at their homes for 4 hours sometimes in relentlessly by police who had just been able to find their face using facial recognition. And we saw through our own research at Amnesty International, for example, that the communities that are more likely to have higher numbers of Black and Brown community members are also more likely to be subjected to facial recognition exposure. We've seen from reports, as I mentioned before, the target acquisition systems in Gaza are targeting Palestinians and rendering lists with incalculable numbers of possibly civilians who are being made synonymous with combatants without any due diligence or any further human inquiry. So all of these systems and the examples that we have of the incalculable human rights violations that emerge from them give us reason to think that there is no way systems that are made up of these component technologies can be compliant with international law, which is why we need that legally binding instrument.
And has there been any progress made towards introducing international standards at the UN this week?
So we have seen in the last 8 years a process at the group of governmental experts on certain conventional weapons in Geneva attempt to open the space for having dialogue on establishing a legally binding instrument on autonomous weapon systems. Unfortunately, those conversations have stalled, and we are of the belief now that it's more important than ever that a number of states that are not present at the CCW, at this group of governmental experts on certain conventional weapons, are present and able to actually participate in this conversation and move the dial towards a legally binding instrument. These are often the member states that are most impacted by autonomous weapon systems. There are states that are either in post-conflict situations or who are in situations of active conflict. And so they're at the most risk, at the highest risk of being subjected to some of these technologies. And naturally, they have a right to have a stake in this conversation. So what we've seen in the last 48 hours is active conversations and participation from these states and from civil society organizations in making it clear that it is time that a UN General Assembly process takes its rightful place in having a conversation that moves us towards a legally binding instrument, which at this stage could look like the further formulation of the resolution that was passed at the last UN General Assembly last year, hopefully moving us towards a negotiating mandate towards a treaty that would establish a legally binding instrument.
And Matt, what would you say to those who suggest that these weapons are actually safer and might pose less of a risk than conventional weapons?
There is no safer without meaningful human control. There is no safer when you are targeting human beings. The digital dehumanization that happens when you devolve the decision to kill or maim to a computational system is simply not one that can be made synonymous with the idea of safer or more efficient. There is such a thing known as automation bias, which is this idea that human beings are attracted to, let's say, computational indicators and systems that seem to, for example, give a score or a color-based indicator that there is a high risk of a threat, or that particular individual or groups or area might have combatants or threats. However, those systems and those indicators are often not subject to interrogation and scrutiny. Human beings are often drawn towards that bias because they trust the system will render the correct result, and oftentimes it's also wound up with wanting to minimize liability and personal liability in particular. And so this idea that somehow these systems are safer and more efficient is simply oftentimes an overblown marketing ploy that attempts to move the conversation towards the further investment into these technologies, when that conversation and that energy and capacity should be spent on instituting a legally binding instrument.
And some suggestions too that defence firms can be convinced somehow to develop these weapons responsibly, but can they be trusted to self-regulate?
Absolutely not. I think at this stage, it's important that we establish the amount of scandals that we've already seen on the back of the use of AI systems, in particular in public sector algorithms, in the context of law enforcement and policing, There are cases of governments sometimes folding and resigning on the back of scandals related to the use of algorithms, for example, in the context of EU member states. It is really important at this stage that these lessons are taken back into the fold as states consider both their relationships with industry that are developing these technology. The pace of development is far outweighing our movement and progress on deliberations around an internationally legally binding instrument. And so it is time that states take matters into their hands as far as moving our determination in line with the pace of development of these technologies.
And Matt, the UN itself has set a deadline of next year for member states to establish clear rules. Bearing in mind all of what you've just told us, is there any chance that that deadline will be respected?
There's a deadline within the CCW, within the group of governmental experts on the certain conventional weapons, set by the Secretary General of the United Nations to indeed start negotiating on a treaty, on a legally binding instrument. However, at this stage, the energy that is being shown within the UNGA process clearly indicates that there is a greater appetite for more inclusive participation from member states that are not at the CCW, and that energy might manifest into a more likely legally binding instrument coming out of those processes. However, with that said, of course, everything is on the table. And if these processes lead to greater urgency around the development of legally binding instruments in all fora, those are, of course, welcome. But we like to see the inclusion of international human rights law in our thinking when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. And it's important that under no circumstances anti-personnel autonomous weapon systems are allowed, and prohibitions must be instated.
Much more to discuss, Matt, but we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. That's Dr Matt Mahmoudi from the University of Cambridge, joining us live from New York.